Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here today and to share in this particular discussion. My life has run pretty much contemporaneously with this process, which I've called the abandonment of the King James Version of the Bible. And as we've just heard, the question I'm posing is that a matter of dumbing down, if you'll pardon the cliche, or is that really a matter of sharpening up and doing something that's sensible and right? Professor Gordon Campbell of Leicester University has written an excellent book to chime in with this 400th anniversary of the King James Version, called simply Bible, the Story of the King James Version. But it takes us up to our own time, and it introduces us to many modern translations. I do recommend that book, and I'm very happy to acknowledge my debt to it in preparing what I've been wanting to say this afternoon. However, there is always a however, isn't there? As Professor Campbell comes to the climax of his book, he demonstrates, I believe, that even hard-headed and learned scholars can become just a little dewy-eyed and sentimental. These are his closing words. The King James Version is the fountainhead of Bible translations into English, and although the finest modern translations are models of good scholarly practice, they're admired rather than loved. It is the King James Version that has been loved by generations of those who have listened to it or read it to themselves or to others. Other translations may engage the mind, but the King James Version is the Bible of the heart. I originally wrote in my notes, I subsequently wrote in my notes, I humbly beg to differ. That may have been true 100 years ago, but I really don't believe it's true any longer today. Having moved in Christian circles for most of my life, I can only say that this would apply to only a tiny minority of people. In the church of which I'm minister in northwest London, I'm in the Harrow-Wembley area of northwest London. In my church, I know of only one person who routinely reads the King James Version of the Bible. And I don't think that even she would describe it as the Bible of the heart. I wonder if I can just be personal for a few minutes. I am, after all, not a scholar. I am a local minister, so I do tend to come to this subject rather from a personal than a scholarly perspective. Just tell you a little bit of my story, perhaps, to show how it meshes in with this theme. When I was a rather spotty 15-year-old boy, I made a decision, the biggest decision I've ever made in all my life, which changed the whole course of my life. I decided to become a Christian. I don't come from a Christian background. My father liked to call himself an agnostic, and my mother, while she would have been deeply shocked at any suggestion that she wasn't a Christian, was not a churchgoer and had a faith which I suspect was largely what we might call nominal. But my older brother and I were packed off to Sunday school on a Sunday afternoon. That was in the days when Sunday school still happened in the afternoon rather than the morning as today. And I don't think I'm doing my parents too great an injustice when I say that a large part of the motive perhaps was to ensure a couple of hours of peace and quiet with the Sunday Express. But they got more than they bargained for, because both my brother and I became Christians. My brother today is an Anglican, and I, 50 years on, am not just a Baptist, but actually a Baptist minister to boot. I shouldn't really impugn my parents' motives, for to be honest, I can't claim that my own were entirely unmixed in those days. The local church to which we were sent had a good number of young people, including, of course, some extremely nice girls. We used to sing a hymn in those days, perhaps some still sing it today. "O Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end." And it contained the line, "My hope to follow duly is in thy strength alone." Just so happened that one of the nicest girls in our group was called Julie. So I can leave you to imagine the furtive smiles that were exchanged between us adolescent boys as we piously sang, "My hope to follow Julie is in thy strength alone." There is a point to this story, by the way. Don't get uncomfortable. I am actually leading somewhere, I hope. I didn't ever, in fact, follow Julie, but there were plenty of others who might be described in terms of present-day university entrance procedures as insurance. And I remember the first present I ever received from a girlfriend. It must have been, I think, in 1964. What was this present? A Beatles record? No. A tie? No. A book? No. Well, yes, a book, but not just any old book. It was, of course, a Bible. What version of the Bible? Well, in those days, there was only one version of the Bible. It was the authorized version, what we called the authorized version in those days. Nobody ever really made clear to me, to explain to me, the fact that the person who had done the authorizing was not God, but King James I. And it took me quite a few years to discover this. I suspect there are still quite a few people around today labouring under the same misapprehension. So there was my first Bible given to me by the first love of my life. Well, I remember as a newborn Christian devouring this Bible hungrily, underlining verses. I was very keen, writing notes in the margin, soaking this Bible up. Yes, there were rumours that there were other Bibles around. I heard the names of Moffat and Knox and Weymouth and one or two other people being mentioned, but the authorized version was indisputably the real Bible. We did hear too of an Anglican who was active at that particular time in putting Paul's letters and the Gospels into modern English. His name was J.B. Phillips. But we were warned his versions were not really translations, they were paraphrases. And that was something very different. 3 years later, I made another life-changing decision. My main subject at school was English, and it was assumed that if I went to university, that was what I would read. But I'd already decided at the age of 16 that I wanted to be a preacher. And if you were going to be a preacher, well, it had to be theology, didn't it? And so I arrived at university, a very lamb among wolves, with O-level Latin, the merest smidgen of Greek, hastily imparted to me in a matter of weeks by the Latin teacher, and just about nothing of ancient history or the classics. It was quite frightening, but what could I do but take a deep breath and plunge into the depths? Looking back now, actually, it reminds me of a comment that was made by my wife when she was expecting our first child. She compared pregnancy to a parachute jump. Once you've started, there's no going back. And I found that getting involved in scholarship, even at that very elementary level, the level of the first year undergraduate, is really rather similar. Once you've started grappling with the biblical languages, questions of authorship, dating, interpretation, etc., you can never regain your previous innocence. You might as well try to squeeze the toothpaste back into the tube or unscramble your scrambled eggs. It cannot be done. So I speedily learned that questions about English translations were pretty much irrelevant now, as I sat at my little desk and sweated over my basic introduction to New Testament Greek. I do remember receiving what I think was intended as a word of encouragement from one of the most frighteningly learned and erudite men I've ever met in all my life, a certain Dr. Austin Farrer. Do remember, Mr. Sedgwick, said Austin Farrer, that languages are not learned primarily with the mind. They are absorbed through the pores. Well, I think I knew what he meant, but I'm not sure it was quite as simple as that. Perhaps my pores weren't quite porous enough. Anyway, fast forward another 5 years, and I'm ordained as a Baptist minister, and I come to my first church. Now, here's another big decision. To persuade the church it was time to buy pew Bibles. Relying on people to bring their own, a once common practice, was unrealistic. and the sight of people sitting with glazed eyes while a perhaps quite difficult passage from Paul was being read was simply intolerable. It was just a sheer waste of time. But if we did buy Bibles, what version should they be? I plumped for the Revised Standard Version. There was, of course, resistance to abandoning the King James Version. I think we should stick with the original. I was told by a stalwart of the church, a lovely, fine Christian man, but a man who had obviously never learned, that not only was the King James Version not the original, but as we've been reminded today, it was by no means even the first English translation. Many had gone before. The King James Version translators were very clear themselves, weren't they? That they were not seeking to produce a new translation, but simply a revision. We aim, they said, not to make a new translation, but to make a good one better. Well, I prevailed in persuading the church in this direction, and shocking though this may now seem to some, I don't know, I have virtually never opened a King James Version since. Indeed, even the Revised Standard Version didn't last that long, for updated though it no doubt was, the big step had not been taken of replacing the these and the thous with you, which was a big thing among us young, keen Christians at that time. We didn't feel comfortable using the these and the thous. I'm informed that archaisms such as these were actually archaic even to the translators of the King James Version. They were consciously using old-fashioned language. The New International Version came along, becoming, I believe, one of the most popular versions, especially in the largely evangelical circles in which I moved and still move today. And so, with that little bit of background to the question in the title of my contribution today, was this act of abandoning the King James Version irresponsible? Were we guilty of betraying our heritage? Was it a case of dumbing down, or were we in fact showing good sense in sharpening up our act? When I use the word we, I do of course include the church at large of all the various denominations, because it was happening in Anglican, Roman Catholic, Methodist, you name it, all the different denominations, not just my own. I think at this point I can do no better than read to you a column which I contributed in February this year to the Times, which sums up largely what I wanted to say. I call this column Gloriously Unusable. That's a title of which I was rather proud, because it seemed to me to sum up the King James Version. Glorious, yes, but unusable in our modern world. But the people at the Times didn't like that title, and they gave it some boring title. But anyway, this is what the article said. The translators of the King James Version of the Bible 400 years ago this year wrote, "We desire that the Scripture may speak like itself, as in the language of Canaan, that it may be understood even of the very vulgar." That's people like you and people like me. An excellent aspiration. Who could possibly argue with it? Ironically, though, the wonderful translation they produced now falls foul of the very principle they so admirably declared. The King James Version is not, pardon the cliché, fit for purpose in the modern world. There are two main requirements for any translation, Bible or otherwise. The first is accuracy, the second is intelligibility. Stylistic considerations are important, but they come a distinctly poor third. In terms of accuracy, the King James Version scores highly. Of course, the translators couldn't possibly get everything perfectly right. They explicitly concede that in another part of their preface. But they deserve the greatest respect for their overall work. In terms of style, the criticism could be made that the King James Version, paradoxically, is just too good, too polished. Scholars have pointed out, for example, that the English of the New Testament is often better than the Greek of the original. So that, for example, Mark has lost some of his earthiness, and Paul some of his pugnacity. It's a nice question, though now, no doubt for another day, at what point does literary excellence actually invalidate a translation? If you translate Anna Karenina out of the Russian into English and you produce better English than the original Russian, is that a good translation? But the real problem is intelligibility. This is obviously not the fault of the translators. It is simply that the English language has changed enormously over the centuries. Not only is the King James Version not understood even of the very vulgar, it is not understood by the great majority. Again, in my church in northwest London, we have significant groups whose first language isn't even English. The thought of requiring them to grapple with Elizabethan language is too ludicrous to contemplate, out of the question. And let's be honest, many of us home-born Brits, however well educated, are much the same, not to mention the local youth. This is why it can be irksome, to say the least, when the suggestion crops up that not to use the King James Version is somehow to deny our heritage, to rob people of this precious literary jewel, and in general to act like a bunch of cultural vandals. The Bible was never meant to be treated as a literary masterpiece. Isaiah wanted to change people's hearts and minds, not to have them drooling over his poetry. Even Luke, the sophisticated doctor who wrote the Gospel and Acts, was primarily concerned with setting the facts out straight. He plainly says so that his readers might understand and believe. So when I hear people, many of whom I suspect never go anywhere near a church, rhapsodizing dewy-eyed over its glorious cadences, I find it hard to choke down the response, "Oh, give me a break." But if this is right, the question arises, what instead? The main problem here is the sheer proliferation of versions, all with their strengths and weaknesses. Just three of the leading contenders are the very popular New International Version, which I mentioned earlier, the New Revised Standard Version, I believe the preferred version of the academics, and the Good News Bible, complete with its delightful line drawings. Do not despise the Good News Bible because of its little pictures. The translation, I believe, is good as well. But whichever we opt for, we need all the help that we can get. The Bible is, after all, a large collection of often very difficult ancient documents. Many translations, therefore, come with background material, explanatory notes, maps, time charts, and the extra cost is well worthwhile. Commentaries, Bible dictionaries, and paraphrases are also vital for anyone serious about Bible reading. The American Eugene Peterson, for example, has done for the whole Bible a truly prodigious achievement, what J.B. Phillips did over 50 years ago for the New Testament. True, his paraphrase, The Message, is very free and doesn't always, as they say, cross the Atlantic too comfortably. But read alongside a tighter rendering, it does much to bring the Bible to life. The work of such scholars stands foursquare in the honourable tradition of the King James Version translators, aiming to do for us, in the 21st century, what their predecessors did even for the very vulgar in the 17th. And they equally deserve our thanks. So I mentioned there that there are these two main considerations that have to be borne in mind when it comes to translations. Obvious, really, accuracy and intelligibility. As I say, as regards accuracy, the King James Version, so they tell me, I have a rough working knowledge of Greek, but I'm certainly no authority. As regards accuracy, the King James Version stands up well. But scholarship moves on very fast and inevitably renders some translations obsolete or at least open to new possibilities. Let me just suggest one very obvious example, one that many of you, I'm sure, will be well aware of. An interesting change that has occurred in many modern translations in the Lord's Prayer with the words, "Lead us not into temptation." Jesus teaches us to pray, "Lead us not into temptation." Even a person with scant understanding of scholarly matters might find that a little bit perplexing if it were not so familiar. Would a good God The God who is our Father in heaven ever lead us into temptation, like taking an alcoholic into a pub? Why would he do such a thing? What many people cannot be expected to understand, how should they? They haven't had the advantage of studying this at any kind of serious level, is that the Greek word used here, peirasmos, is irritatingly ambiguous. It may mean temptation in the moral sense, enticement to do evil, or it may mean testing in a neutral sense, being put to the test. Now, true, we can't say that the King James Version translators were actually wrong here. Their translation is technically possible. But further scholarly consideration of that ambiguity seems to have tipped the scales the other way. Do not bring us to the time of trial, New Revised Standard Version. Do not bring us to hard testing, the Living Bible. Do not bring us to the test, New English Bible. Don't bring us to the great trial, capital T, Tom Wright. In this respect, the King James Version would appear to have yielded the field to the modern translations. The problem, of course, with any translation is it soon becomes frozen. It's a bit like the telephone directory. The moment it's published, it's out of date somewhere. That is why, even though the recent avalanche of Bible translations may be rather bewildering, Scouse Bibles, Cockney Bibles, Youth Bibles, Women's Bibles, Men's Bibles, you name it, it'll be there somewhere, they are nonetheless to be welcomed. We need all the help we can get in our reading of the Bible. But it is, of course, in the area of intelligibility that real problems arise. Language changes to such a degree that even words in use 30 years ago are now out of date and unintelligible. I read recently of a revision of a major dictionary that is soon, I think, to be published, where they have decided to jettison certain words. The word charabang comes to my mind, because they've fallen out of use. Is that sad? Well, I think it is sad, but you've got to be realistic. You can't have a working dictionary that expands ad infinitum. Ask anyone over 40 what a mouse is, they will probably have no hesitation in describing a small four-footed rodent. But ask a child under 15 what a mouse is, and you're likely to receive a very different answer. It's the gadget I use to work my computer. At what point does the latter meaning become the primary meaning of the word? Language is gloriously slippery. It's always changing, and it's always moving. Again, referring to my own young days as a young Christian, I remember being puzzled by simple ambiguities in the King James Version text. Drink ye all of it, said Jesus to his disciples at the Last Supper. And I used to wonder what might happen to me if I left some. All of you drink this clears it up nicely. Paul tells the Christians of Rome that he has long wanted to visit them, but was let hitherto. He was let hitherto. Well, what was the problem then? Let him get on with it. But of course the Greek word colo means precisely the opposite of what we now mean by let, except the legal term without let or hindrance. It means prevented. I was prevented hitherto, is what Paul is actually saying. These are very obvious examples, trivial examples perhaps, but I think they do illustrate the great difficulty involved in seeking to enable the ordinary man or woman in the pew to understand the Bible. Good modern translations are absolutely vital. Indeed, the fact that some years ago a new King James Version, NKJV, appeared on the market, though I personally have never yet met anyone who uses it, seems a tacit acceptance that the original King James Version is simply no longer what we need. But of course the literary defenders of the King James Version, I'm not speaking now of the extreme evangelical and fundamentalist wings, especially prominent in America. The literary defenders of the King James Version rest their case not so much on matters of accuracy or even intelligibility, but on the undoubted beauty of the language. It is the stylistic factor that predominates. Much is made, and quite rightly, of the many memorable phrases the King James Version has bequeathed to the English we still use, often without realising it, even today. But, even here, we need to be careful. In many such instances, as the King James Version translators were perfectly happy to recognise, the credit is hardly due to them. They knew very well that they were climbing on the shoulders of the giants who had gone before them. Take, for example, the famous words of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. "Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Wonderful King James Version. But now go back nearly 100 years to William Tyndale. How does Tyndale render this verse? "Watch and pray that ye fall not into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." A difference of just 2 words. What about the words of the old Simeon as he cradles the baby Jesus in his arms? King James Version has, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word." Beautiful. What does Tyndale have? "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy promise." 1 word difference. So any suggestion that the King James Version was ushering into our language all these wonderfully memorable phrases apparently is simply mistaken. Professor Campbell, whom I mentioned at the beginning, offers the startling observation: it has been estimated that 83% of the King James Version published in 1611 derives from Tyndale, either directly or indirectly through other Bibles. That's a statistic, I think, worth serious contemplation. I'm afraid I haven't read Professor David Crystal's book Begat, but reading the reviews I get the impression that he too is going rather along that same line. Now, of course, to say all this is not in any way to discredit the King James Version or its translators, most certainly not. It is simply to point out that the King James Version has been the recipient of much adulation which, I repeat yet again, it never wanted or asked for, to which it really has no right. That the regular statements about the profound influence of the King James Version upon our language are seriously overblown. Suppose King James had in fact never encouraged this version to be produced. Would all these memorable phrases have faded into obscurity? We'll never know, but I think it's highly unlikely. As a Christian, of course, I find welcome support in those among the Christian intelligentsia who have seen fit to comment on this misguided emphasis on the Bible primarily as literary treasure as opposed to sacred text. Some indeed have found it intensely irritating. Listen to C.S. Lewis, that crusty old iconoclast, on the matter of the King James Version's rhythms and cadences. "I am not at all sure," writes Lewis, "that resemblance in rhythm, unless supported by some other resemblance, is usually recognisable. If I say," this is so typical C.S. Lewis, "if I say, 'At the regatta, Madge avoided the river and the crowd,' would that without warning remind you of, 'In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth'?" Lewis, of course, has mischievously concocted a sentence exactly equivalent to Genesis 1:1 in both word number and syllables per word. In other words, what he's saying is the rhythm, it's inherent in the meaning of the words. The fact that exactly the same rhythm applies to something majestic, as in Genesis 1, and to something merely commonplace, as in Lewis's illustration, is purely coincidental. It is not the consequence of any great literary sensitivity. Lewis, in fact, energetically opposes any notion of the Bible designed to be read as literature. It is, he says, and you can sort of see the flames coming out of his mouth here, it is, he says, not merely a sacred book, but a book so remorselessly and continuously sacred that it does not invite, it excludes or repels the merely aesthetic approach. You can read it as literature only by a tour de force. You are cutting the wood against the grain, using the tool for a purpose it was not intended to serve. Putting it very simply, Lewis says, I cannot help suspecting that those who read the Bible as literature do not really read the Bible at all. Richard Dawkins, the Prince of Wales, the late Michael Foot are names that come to my mind, in spite in two cases of their atheism or agnosticism, as lamenting the demise of the King James Version, or at least being keen on its preservation. Well, rather that the Bible be read as literature than not read at all, who knows when someone might get converted. But if Lewis is right, they are missing the very point of reading it in the first place, rather like people who go to watch a thriller and come away only able to enthuse about the camera work or the scenery, or somebody goes to see Hamlet and can only enthuse about the costumes. T.S. Eliot is equally scathing. Those who talk about the Bible as a monument of English prose are merely admiring it as a monument over the grave of Christianity, says Eliot. The Bible has a literary influence upon English literature, not because it has been considered as literature, but because it has been considered as the report of the Word of God. My wife and I, sometimes when we're looking for a day out, we visit one of those living or working museums. You may have visited them also yourself. You can go to these places. It's a nice experience. You can wander round a recreated village. You can watch, for example, a blacksmith working at his forge, or a woman in a long dress and a pinafore baking cakes in a primitive oven, even a farmer perhaps feeding his pigs. If you feel like an ice cream, you can stop a boy on an ancient bike, dressed in knickerbockers and corduroy cap, and he will offer you the contents of a big square box on his handlebars. They're good places, these living museums, but they are museums. Would you want to live permanently in one? No running water, no electricity. The problem, I think, the analogy I think is fair, the problem with those who value the Bible largely for its literary value is that their model of the church is all wrong. They may not realise it, but they're turning the church into a kind of living museum, something rather quaint, nice for a visit, nice to sentimentalise over, but of no practical value. Does this mean that there's no place for the King James Version? No, but from the point of view of the believing Christian, that place must be seen for what it is. Let's come clean and say it. The place of the King James Version, it's the realm of the scholar, it's the realm of the aesthete, it's the realm of the museum curator. The King James Version is a wonderful book, but it is not a working book. And the church, if it is anything at all, is a working body. People coming together out of a shared faith in the events to which the Bible and the Bible alone bears testimony. Now, of course, somebody might well say, well, it's now 40 years or more since this wholesale act of abandonment started to take place. Look what's happened since. Can you honestly claim that it's achieved anything worthwhile? Don't we keep hearing statistics that show that the church is shrinking fast? Shouldn't all this modernisation have led by now to a resurgence of interest in the church and in Christian things? It's a fair point. It's a good question. Indeed, it's one, I think, which deserves another lecture really all to itself. All I would say is this, that the numerical decline in the church is attributable to a whole range of factors. The increasing secularisation of our society, the worship of the great god materialism being, of course, very much to the fore. And while, of course, it would be impossible to prove this, there is no doubt in my mind that things would be very much worse if the church had clung stubbornly to the King James Version. I might just add also that if we look around for churches which are bucking this modern trend of numerical decline, they are very likely, I don't say absolutely necessary, but they are very likely to be precisely those churches that have wholeheartedly embraced the modern idiom, not only in the Bibles they use, but also in their music, even their dress codes, and all sorts of other things. I pause at this point because I've got a little digression just for half a minute, if I may mount a hobby horse just for a moment. I can't resist commenting that dismissive remarks about the happy, clappy churches are often extremely unfair. I don't think of myself particularly as a charismatic, and I'm certainly not a happy, clappy, but I can only respect the fact that many of these churches are the ones that are making meaningful contact with the drug addicts and the gang members. Often it is these church members who are out in the town centres in the early hours of a Saturday morning working as street pastors, picking drunken youngsters out of the gutters, giving flip-flops to girls who can no longer stand on their spindly heels, offering coffee to drink and perhaps a shoulder to cry on. We talk about modernisation, dumbing down, but believe me, it isn't all froth and bubble. There's real substance there as well. End of my digression. Sorry, not the end of the lecture. You've got 10 lines left. Then feel free. So, was the church's abandonment of the King James Version an act of dumbing down or an exercise in sharpening up? Everything hinges on whether you view the Bible as literary artifact or as inspired scripture. You won't be in any doubt as to my view of the matter, assuming you stayed awake for the last half hour. Looking back now, there seems to have been an absolute inevitability about the process. Once it started, there was no stopping it. The wonder really is that the church stayed with the King James Version as long as it did. I yield to no one, as they say, in my admiration for the King James Version and for those who produced it. Thank God for it. Thank God for them. But let's not fool ourselves that it remains a practical, working Bible today. Because, sorry, it ain't.